What's going on, Midwestern Marks viewers? My name's Eddie, and today we are going to be doing our third YouTube book club slash book talk, and we're going to be talking about Friedrich Engels' The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State. So recently I got done leading a book club on Origins. It was the book club for our Patreon supporters that we do bi-weekly. So now I've actually gotten the chance to read Origins about 2 or 3 times, so I figured I should take advantage of that and turn it into a YouTube book discussion. So our previous book discussions focused on Lenin's State and Revolution, as well as Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. And I think this is a good intro text for Marxism that goes along well with those other books. This is a great text for understanding the Marxist conception of history, what we call historical and dialectical materialism. This book is extremely useful in actually understanding what that means and actually understanding how to apply the historical and dialectical materialist method as a way to look at history and as a way to look at existing institutions in society and the existing formation of society. So what Engels is really doing here is looking at the field of prehistory, or what we call anthropology. So Marx discusses a lot the transition between in Europe from feudalism to capitalism, and how the developments in production or economics created the conditions for the bourgeois class in Europe, the capitalist class, to take power from the feudal monarchs, including taking power of the state or the government. And in doing so, they changed the form of the state. They made it a state that works for capitalism at the behest of the bourgeoisie, rather than a state which worked for feudalism and worked to keep the peasants in line, serving their feudal lords. And the state has, of course, developed since then. The U.S. state apparatus has evolved into a giant empire-maintaining entity with many arms all over the world. And that is, a reflection of changes and developments in production and changes in the geopolitical formation that has allowed the U.S. to rise as this hegemonic superpower for the last 70 years, although they're now being challenged by the socialist state of China and also China's allies. But I digress. What Engels is looking at here in Origins is how these things like the state arose in the first place. So not how they changed their forms, which is something Marx talks a lot about, but how did it arise in society? Did it always exist in society? And how has the state changed its form, the way it functions, since it has arisen? And that's the question that Engels is going to try and answer here. What are the origins, the beginnings of the family, private property, and the state? Or how well can we know the origins of these things with the current information and level of scientific and development and historical understanding that we have? So Engels has to draw from the most relevant anthropological information that exists to him at the time, but obviously this has evolved and changed, and Engels understood this, as did Marx, that these texts would need to be updated and changed as scientific information and our understanding of the world around us and history increase. So Engels finds that the state and private property weren't things that were forced upon society, but they grew out of society after not existing for many years. They grow out of society through the contradictions that develop in society as human productivity increases, causing a surplus to arise or a surplus to become possible. Basically, humans' ability to use tools to interact with the world around them and produce things that they needed to survive was slowly increasing and developing with time, as it does, which allowed for human societies to no longer be hunter-gatherers or nomadic societies traveling to wherever the food was, but they were able to produce their food, and this allowed societies to become more sufficient and more able to stay in one place, which allowed them to create a surplus, an abundance of goods, and they started storing goods rather than just taking what they needed to survive. Engels also talks about how closely the state and private property are interconnected from the moment that they both begin developing and arise in society. The other societal element that Engels is going to try to trace the origins of is the form of the family. how the family is organized, and how changes in the family form that's common to most of society are connected to changes in production as well as changes to the state and private property. So there's a common myth that the nuclear family was designed by God and was implemented by God. And this was an especially prevalent myth in Europe at the time when Engels was writing this book, as Protestantism was arising in the forms of Lutheranism and Calvinism alongside the rise of capitalism, which is something Marx and Engels also wrote a lot about. And Engels is going to say that's a myth. Actually, the family form changed over time. It wasn't always a nuclear family ordained by a higher power, but the family form evolved and changed, as we said, with changes in production and changes in other elements of society. So Engels is actually going to argue that these family forms that developed all over the world historically all have their own peculiarities, but they look similar in all societies globally and historically based on the level of productive development that those societies have. So once these societies reach a certain level of technical productive development, ability to produce, their family forms start to change, and Engels is going to say they change in very similar ways, even, in places that are not even close to one another or related to one another, which is an interesting argument. And I'm not an anthropologist, so I can't confirm that one, but I'm really interested to read the comments after doing these videos to see if anybody has critiques of Engels' anthropological arguments that he was making in the 19th century. Also, to help us remain critical and compare Engels to modern anthropology, we'll be using David Graeber's recent bestseller, The Dawn of Everything, which is an anarchist anthropology text. And it doesn't directly take on the arguments of Marx and Engels, but it definitely gives a different narrative, and becomes a contradictory narrative to the narrative of Marx and Engels at many points. David Graeber argues that there's always been a state, there's always been private property, and there's always been money, which directly contradicts what Engels is going to argue in Origins. So we'll address that, and we'll also address some commentary on David Graeber's work added by modern Marxist anthropologists using modern research. And I'll also do my best to correct Engels in places where science has made his analysis outdated, although of course I'm not an anthropologist, so I'll just be doing my best. And if you have any critiques or anything you want to add, put it in the comments. As with all my reading guides, I'll of course try to consistently point out where the text is relevant for our situation and our society today. So yeah, let's get into it. Without further ado, Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State, Translator's Preface. Alright, so before the preface even starts, there's an opening quote from Engels that's right on the center of the page, at least in my version of the book. And it says, "What is good for the ruling class is alleged to be good for the whole of society, with which the ruling class identifies itself." So this is a really good quote, sums up a lot of the arguments that Engels is going to make in this book, and it's really easy to think about how this quote applies to modern capitalism and our modern situation. When the stock market is going up, the capitalists tell us the economy is good, and this is basically them alleging that what is good for the ruling class is good for all of society. As is saying it will trickle down eventually, the classic, infamous trickle-down economics. This is the ruling class identifying themselves and identifying their own wealth with that of the whole of society. What's good for us is good for all of society. We, the ruling class, are the leaders of society. Our wealth trickles down. What's good for us is good for everybody. This is pretty typical, something that we've heard in modern politics over the last 40 years of neoliberalism since Ronald Reagan. And this is true of every society. The ruling class has always portrayed themselves or identified themselves with the whole of society and alleged that's what's good for them is good for everybody. So yeah, that's the first quote. Let's get into the translator's preface from Ernest Unterman, which was published in 1902. So I talk about the translator's preface because Ernest Unterman did a really good job, and there's a couple interesting things in here in relation to book translations. So he says that Americans at the time had missed out on Darwin and Marx because Darwin and Marx were not popular to translate, and thus didn't get English translations forever. So obviously both Darwin and Marx wrote extremely technical works with a lot of broad vocabulary, so they're very difficult to translate. But the main reason they weren't translated is because they were threatening to capital and religion, two of the most powerful institutions in society at the time. So people were afraid to translate Darwin and Marx because they were afraid it would be seen as them challenging religion by promoting Darwin's theory of evolution, or challenging the institutional powers by translating Marx's theory of socialism. But Ernest Unterman says that he is taking the time to translate Origins because of its usefulness to socialists, to have a comprehensive history of the development of existing social institutions in society. He also talks about how the book is based on Lewis Henry Morgan's Ancient Society, which was the best anthropological text at the time. But that great work of historical evidence by Lewis Henry Morgan needed someone to take it and infuse it with dialectical and historical materialist analysis, which is what Friedrich Engels did. So that's the end of the translator's preface. It's pretty good. Let's go on to the author's preface to the first edition, which was written in 1984 by Engels. Hey, this is Eddie from the future editing this video. Engels wrote this in 1884, not 1984, obviously. Dang, past Eddie. That guy is a dum-dum. So I know a lot of people might skip the prefaces, but when it comes to Marx and Engels, that is not the way to go. They put a lot of interesting information in their prefaces. They put a lot about their methodology in their prefaces, and there's just a lot of interesting tidbits in there, even if they can be a little bit tedious to read. But I'll summarize most of the interesting information in this preface to the first edition from '84. So Engels says that Marx wanted to do a full analysis of Lewis Henry Morgan's Ancient Society and infuse it with historical and dialectical materialist analysis by looking at ancient society alongside Marx's own materialist analysis of historical development, Das Kapital. So he wanted to take Ancient Society, the best anthropological text at the time, look at it alongside Das Kapital, and infuse it with Marx's own analysis. But unfortunately, Marx died before he was able to do that. So the ever humble Engels says, I'm no Marx, but I'm going to give it a shot. And I'll try to finish the work that Marx wanted to do before he died, looking at anthropology alongside capital and Marx's conception of history. And Engels is going to do this using a lot of the notes that Marx left behind. So Marx's materialist conception of history, we'll get into what that means a little deeper here. It says the decisive element of history is the production and reproduction of life and life's material requirements. The production and reproduction of life and life's material requirements are the decisive element of history, according to Marx. So that means the production of the means of existence, like food, shelter, clothes, and tools, as well as the production of new people. So basically making babies to continue the species. And Marx and Engels say the social institutions of any time depend on the productive development of labor and the family. So how developed labor is, how much humans are able to produce, how quickly, how easily they're able to produce the means of existence that they need to continue on the species. That is the main thing which affects the social institutions which exist. The institutions like the state, in the form of the family, or religious institutions. So originally in society, labor is divided by sex. So women and men have different jobs. We think of like hunter-gatherer or whatever, or women handle a lot of the domestic work while men are getting a lot of the food or whatever. But as productive capability increases, as these early societies' ability to produce things, produce their means of existence increases, the existence of private property, the exchange of commodities, and overall wealth also increase. So as labor's productivity goes up, as humans' ability to use tools to produce the things they need gets better and better, private property, exchange, and the overall wealth of societies increases alongside that. And this creates the possibility for dividing labor by class based on ownership of material wealth. So now those who don't own a bunch of material wealth are the ones who labor, and those who own a bunch of material wealth are the ones who don't. And that becomes the way that labor is divided in society. Division of labor is a very important concept to Marx and Engels, and it has lots of effects on things like social institutions. So they say that labor had to be divided by sex when tribes or these societies were just gathering what they needed to survive. But as soon as they have a surplus and abundance of wealth because of the advancements in the productivity of labor, it creates the possibility for dividing society and organizing labor by class and ownership of material wealth rather than by sex. So the development of private property, labor, exchange, and wealth then are the foundations of class society's original formation and the foundation for class antagonisms. The development of labor, which leads to increases in private property, exchange, and overall wealth, form the foundation of class society. And as these class antagonisms develop, based on the new division of society by class, as these classes fight with each other, it actually drives society to develop and change with increasing speed. So production and other factors related to it continue developing until they outgrow the existing institutions of society and create a revolution or a change in those institutions, changing their form to fit the new developments of society. Using the example that Marx and Engels give us at the time, the newly developed wealth and ability and capabilities of labor overthrew the division of labor based on sex and replaced it with a division of labor based on ownership of the means of production. Whoever owns the means of production, the tools that are being used to labor with, are now the dominant class, and those who don't own the means of production are the laborers, overthrowing the previous institution where labor was divided by sex, where people had different jobs based on their sex. So Engels also here ends the preface by addressing the methodology and how he gathers his evidence, where this evidence is coming from, which is very common to this book. Engels is going to talk a lot about other anthropologists, and it's common to Marx and Engels in general to cite like a million people because they're trying to do a materialist analysis, so they have to draw from the most modern scientific and historical research available to them. So Engels talks about how Morgan got a lot of his information for ancient societies by studying North American native populations, who he studied for about 40 years in the process of writing his book. Engels says that he is going to add to Morgan's analysis of Greece and Rome, his anthropological analysis of Greece and Rome, and Engels will also add his own analysis of the Celts and the Germans. And overall, Engels is just going to increase the focus of his anthropological analysis on economics. Or production in relation to the societal changes that were observed by Morgan and other anthropologists at the time. That is the end of the author's preface to the first edition. Next, we'll jump 7 years into the future, in 1891, where Engels writes the author's preface to the fourth edition. Alright, so the preface to the fourth edition comes in 1891, 7 years after Engels published the first edition of the book. So he says that he felt the need to publish this fourth edition of the book because the knowledge of primeval history has increased. Anthropological research has increased the amount that we know about these ancient or primeval societies. And this just shows how Engels and Marx understood that their work was going to constantly need to be updated in order to remain scientific, and they did so themselves frequently when they were alive, updating their own work to remain current, which, a lot of times Marx and Engels are portrayed as these arrogant people who thought they knew how society would develop, and they envisioned this utopia that society would become, and, nothing could be further from the truth. They were staunch materialists who wanted to analyze the development of society as it developed and constantly update their analysis of that development because one of the rules that Marx and Engels realized is that things are unchanging, things aren't stagnant. So this preface, though, is actually pretty complex. Engels is calling out a lot of English chauvinism in academia, particularly in the field of anthropology. He's going to say that the field basically shunned Lewis Henry Morgan for proving a lot of them wrong, but then eventually started plagiarizing Morgan's ideas the more that he was proven correct by continued research. So I tried to give a summary of all of Engels' criticisms of English anthropology during our Patreon book club, and it just did not work out. It became way too convoluted with me trying to explain all of these different theories from different people who Engels is critiquing. So if you want a summary of English anthropology in the late 1800s, or if you want to read Engels tearing a lot of the most famous English anthropologists apart, go ahead and read the whole preface yourself. It's pretty interesting. He critiques their methodology and the way that they actually gather their evidence. So it's really interesting if you're in academia. But we're going to skip over quite a bit of it. We'll just hit on the main points. So his main point is that Morgan revolutionized anthropology, revolutionized the field, with a massive survey that he conducted based on years of his study of Iroquois societies and their systems of kinship. So he found common forms of marriage in North America, Asia, Africa, Australia, and he deeply studied one of the family forms that was found in Hawaii. So this revolutionized the field of prehistory, opening the path for future study in the field of anthropology, partially by debunking a lot of myths and pointing future anthropologists in the right direction. So he destroyed the most popular European anthropological theorist at the time, whose name was John F. McClellan. McClellan had this idealist theory of exogamous versus endogenous tribes. So his theory was that exogamous tribes, who were apparently the tribes and the forms of the family which made up ancient societies way back. He said that exogamous tribes banned intermarriage and would only marry outside of the tribe, versus endogamous tribes, who he said married within their own tribe. And this theory was super wrong, but it was accepted for a while, and it blocked the way for new and better theories to come through. So McClellan's main flaw was that he didn't look at how family forms changed over time, and he thought that the form of the family that he discovered was universal to ancient societies up until a certain point. So Morgan comes along and says there are no exogamous or endogamous groups, but actually what McClellan saw were these groups called gens or gents, who developed out of previously existing societies who had communal family forms. So the gents were family-like small groups based on a maternal lineage who banned intermarriage. So they were small groups, basically sort of like a family, based on the mom, based on the family member's relation to the mom. So maternal lineage, and they banned intermarriage. So you couldn't intermarry within that little group. So men would choose wives within the larger tribe, of which many gens made up the larger tribe, but they had to pick wives outside of their own gen, within the tribe, but outside their gen. So the gens were exogamous, and the tribes were endogamous, which is what led to McClellan's confusion. But Morgan comes along with his book Ancient Societies and is able to correct that confusion and point out what's actually going on. You have gens, which make up a larger tribe, and the gens have banned intermarriage, or had banned intermarriage, but people married within the larger tribe. So the discovery of these matriarchal gens allowed anthropologists to, for the first time, create a timeline or map of prehistory, of anthropological development. So they already knew that patriarchal gens had came about later. They had groups similar to these gens, but based on men as the head of the household, and based on a patriarchal, male-dominated society and state. So now that they know about these previously existing matriarchal gens, they know that the patriarchal gens must have developed from the matriarchal gens. So in this way, Morgan is able to open up or allow anthropologists to create a timeline of how these different family forms developed over time through the discovery of matriarchal gens, which preceded the patriarchal gens. And a lot of what Ingalls is going to do is look at the different factors which caused the patriarchal or the matriarchal gens to evolve into patriarchal gens. So research in anthropology and prehistory increased rapidly once anthropologists knew more closely what to look for after the release of Ancient Societies. And Ingalls says that Morgan's work was only enriched by doing more research. His theories were only proven correct by doing more research and taking a closer look at prehistory based on these theories that Morgan had developed. So Ingalls thanks him for this and says he's done a major deed to socialism, allowing us to create a comprehensive dialectical and historical materialist analysis of prehistory and anthropology. So that's the end of all the prefaces, the translator's prefaces and the author's prefaces. A lot of interesting stuff in there. But now we'll be moving on to Chapter 1, the real meat of Ingalls' argument. So I'm excited for this. I'm excited to work through this book with all of you, and I hope you're excited too. All right, see you later.